I would like to welcome you to the second in our three-part series on religion and democracy. My name is Reinhard Krauss, and the webinars are a collaborative project by Islamic City, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies, where I serve as the executive director. A quick note about the format. We will have, again, three presenters who will each provide a brief 10-minute introduction to the topic from their respective religious tradition. This will be followed by a conversation by the three panelists and the three responders, as well as questions from the audience. You can type in your questions in the YouTube live stream. At the moment, we are all bombarded with campaign ads for the upcoming midterm elections, and one is more shrill than the next. Our political discourse has largely deteriorated into shouting matches. Amidst all the noise, democracy itself is being questioned and under serious threat as a shared foundational consensus of this nation. In this perilous moment, we decided that it would be important to raise our voices and articulate why democracy matters for people of faith. Not just one particular faith tradition, but to people from a broad spectrum of religious perspectives. People of faith orient their beliefs and their conduct on holy scriptures, believed to contain divinely revealed truth and ethical mandates. Some argue that the God-given truth and ethical mandates of their particular tradition must also be implemented in the political arena. Such a demand for a divinely mandated political order, or a theocracy, is obviously incompatible with democracy, in which political authority is based on the collective will of all people, regardless of their particular religious convictions. The second forum today will explore why people of faith should reject theocratic models of political authority in favor of democracy. And as our first presenter, I would like to welcome Rabbi Dr. Aryeh Cohen. Rabbi Cohen is professor of rabbinic literature and the former chair of the Rabbinics department at American Jewish University. His research and scholarship combine Talmud, Jewish ethics, and social justice activism. Dr. Cohen is also the rabbi in residence at Bend the Arc Jewish Action, a national social justice organization. And he is the co-convener of the Black Jewish Justice Alliance and a member of Clergy for Black Lives. We welcome him today to provide us with an introduction to today's topic through a Jewish lens. Dr. Cohen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Reinhard. Thank you to this forum. I'm really honored to be here. So the question is, should Jewish people favor democracy over theocracy? There's a lot here that is left unpacked and undefined. Which Jewish people, for example? According to Pew, and this is a quote, about 1 in 10 Jewish Americans, 12%, say they attend religious services at least weekly in a synagogue, temple, or less formal setting, such as a Chabura or independent minyan, compared with about a quarter of US adults who say they attend religious services weekly or more. US Jews are also less likely than the overall US public to say religion is very important to them, 21% of Jews versus 41% of all other people. Slightly more than half of Jews say religion is not to or not at all important in their lives, compared with 1/3 of Americans overall who say the same. There are even bigger gaps when it comes to belief in God. Around a quarter of Jews, 26%, say they believe in God, quote, as described in the Bible, while 56% of all US adults say this. While ignoring what it might mean to believe in God as described in the Bible, is that Genesis or Daniel, most Jews are not religiously Jewish. For these people, 80 to 90% of Jews, the choice would be pretty straightforward. Democracy is the clear choice for those who are not religious or for whom religion is not too important in their lives. We should also unpack democracy. We are living in an era of illiberal democracies in which minority rights are not necessarily protected. I don't suppose that most Jews, religious or not, will want to be a minority in an illiberal democracy. What about theocracy? Judaism, or more accurately, Israelite religion, was an actual theocracy for much of its early life. When the Israelites lived independently, their self-rule was either tribal or monarchic, with direct or indirect rule by priests or prophets. Once the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, theocratic rule became a theoretical construct. However, the basic text of Rabbinic Judaism still believed that monarchy, a theocratic monarchy, was the preferred goal and favored form of political organization. The religious polity that was imagined in the Mishnah and then in both Talmuds, the cornerstone texts of Rabbinic Judaism, was a monarchy with a priesthood. The added factor in Rabbinic Judaism was that the rabbis held final legislative power over both priest and king. This was illustrated in various texts, which showed the rabbis schooling the high priest prior to the temple service for Yom Kippur, the most important service of the year, and the rabbis in the form of the Sanhedrin being the court which sat in judgment over the king. This preference continued while Jews were ruled by both Crescent and Krauss. Maimonides' great 13th century law book, the Mishneh Torah, includes sections on monarchic rule and priestly service, including a method by which the ordination, which is necessary to restore priest and king, could be renewed. One of the first major cracks in this solid front was offered by Don Isaac Abravanel, the 15th century sage and Torah commentator, who was also a member of two royal courts. He was caught up in the expulsions of Jews from both Portugal and Spain. Perhaps as a result of his experience with the royal house, he wrote a scathing criticism of monarchy, deriding the Talmudic saying that all who say that King David sinned is mistaken. Abravanel looked to Venetian republicanism as a model of the appropriate type of political system. It was, in his eyes, a system that could correct itself, since the ruler would occupy the ruling office for only a short period of time and then have to pay for his misdeeds. Abravanel's voice was a dissenting voice in the tradition. The next important step came in the 19th and 20th centuries when the possibility of an actual Jewish polity arose in the renewal of Zionism. The question then was, within religious circles, within general Zionist circles, the assumption was that the state would be Zionist, which itself is surprising since most of the Zionists in the 19th century did not live in democratic countries. The Rabbi, in the early 20th century, Rabbi Chaim Hirschenson, who was born in Jerusalem, but self-exiled to Hoboken, New Jersey, soon to be the home of Frank Sinatra, when asked in the 1920s about whether the state of Israel that did not yet exist would be a democracy, answered in the affirmative. And through erudite and complicated halachic or Jewish legal reasoning, asserted that democracy and democratic elections were an obligation based in Torah. Now, it's important to understand before we go on how radical that change was. Until then, there were those who said, who claimed, who understood that living in a democratic culture was better because, it afforded Jews rights. And most of the time, most of the discussions of what type of polity Jews would thrive in was based on to what extent the polity was lenient or accommodating towards Jews. Rabbi Chaim Hirschenson was the first person who gave an affirmative argument about the fact that democracy, and more specifically, he was focusing in on democratic elections, were a biblical commandment, were an obligation. He read the verse in Hebrew, Shoftim v'shochim tasim lecha, that you shall appoint judges and officers, as saying that you shall elect rulers. It was a very unique understanding, interpretation of the word shoftim as rulers rather than judges. And then following this are all kinds of obligations around not having, not against bribery, against false testimony. And he folded those into the notion that elections have to be free and fair, and there can't be bribery or misstatements in elections and fraud in elections. And so he was the first person who really changed the conversation around democracy to say that democracy itself was not only good ultimately in a utilitarian way, but actually an obligation. Though he was not necessarily popular then. He had to leave Jerusalem when he did because he lost the fight over women's suffrage in Jerusalem amongst the religious authorities. And his thought didn't take hold until much, much later. And we can see that now, a century later, Israel was established, but is itself a partial theocracy. Matters of marriage and divorce, burial are decided by the rabbinate for Jews and by Muslim and Christian authorities for those groups. However, even more disturbingly, matters of state security and foreign policy, annexation of land and human rights are also influenced by parties led by religious figures for whom human rights is not actually an important value. So ultimately, the tradition is not, except for certain specific figures, is not a bastion of support for democratic rule and for democracy. There is, however, when Jews think about democracy, especially Jews who live in democracies, seem to understand it as being transparently good and transparently appropriate. The reason for that is that it comes from the notion that it is only within a democratic culture that Jewish life can thrive. And ultimately, the value which reigns within this, and which I think that Jews and all other and people from other religions also should believe in, is a multiracial democracy which protects minority rights, because this is the best way to achieve a society in which all people can thrive. And we see that nowadays, even in the United States, that there are Orthodox Jews who are throwing in with right-wing Christian nationalists around because of the fact that they can gain some short advantage around religion, what they call religious freedom, in terms of abortion and gay rights, or being against gay rights, not having gay rights. But for Jews as a whole, it seems to me that when thinking of people as people, when understanding that everybody was created and is available to be loved and to receive the blessings of God, I would argue that for both Jews and non-Jews, it is, the best way to achieve a society in which all people can thrive is through a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, in which the minority rights are protected. And so to mix the hopes of the preamble of the Constitution with Psalms, the way to form a more perfect union and to construct the world as a kingdom of God, is to build a multiracial democracy. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you for a smorgasbord of food for thought that you laid out. I have many questions. I'm sure our panelists have many questions, but let's first go to Dr. Jana Goslin. She is the coordinator and professor of Christian spiritual formation at the New Theological Seminary of the West. As a former attorney, she possesses a rare combination of expert perspectives on both law and religious studies. Dr. Goslin also serves as vice president of the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies, and we welcome her to share her reflections based on the Christian tradition. Dr. Goslin. Yes, that mic.
Thank you, Reinhard, and thank you to the Academy and Islamic City for sponsoring this webinar. My talk tonight will focus on the recent emergence of a trend in Christianity that bumps up against our topic of theocracy versus democracy. That trend is Christian nationalism. Don't get me wrong, Christian nationalism itself is not recent. This ideology has circulated in right-wing camps for many years. It was just that, though, in the past, you didn't say that part out loud. Now, sadly, Christian nationalists are writing books, speaking out, and influencing our elected leaders. There's no surprise that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert have both jumped on the Christian nationalist bandwagon. That Donald Trump has exploited its followers is no secret, given the many Jesus flags flown at the January 6th insurrection. but other currently elected leaders are also beginning to flirt with its adherents. At this point, I want to go on record as both a lawyer and a Christian to state that I find that any sort of Christian nationalism to be abhorrent and antithetical to my love of country and to my Christian values. This ideology violates two concepts which conservatives typically hold up to be sacrosanct: the Constitution and Jesus's teaching. Thus, in my short time tonight, I will first define Christian nationalism and dive into the topic by briefly looking at two recently published books by self-proclaimed Christian nationalists. Then I will briefly explain why Christian nationalism is, in my opinion, unconstitutional and unbiblical. First, I will leave the definitions to the sociologists. Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry write in their 2020 book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, that Christian nationalism is a cultural framework, both an ideology and a mythology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. To this end, both books that I will examine advocate for American society and government to be guided by Christian principles and led by Christians. In Christian Nationalism, a biblical guide for taking dominion and discipling nations, an Amazon bestseller, Andrew Torba and Andrew Isker write that Christian nationalists today seek to reestablish states that recognize Jesus Christ as King, the general Christian faith as the foundation of state government, and state laws that reflect in every way possible and reasonable Christian morality and charity. Although the book does not advocate the overthrow of our current government, it does argue for forming a parallel Christian society that can take over when our current society fails, which the authors say is inevitable. The authors see our current society as corrupt and morally decaying due to legalized abortion, gay rights, and other aspects of liberal society antithetical to their views. Although they would tolerate non-Christians in their imaginary new nation, non-Christians would not be allowed to hold office or any other leadership positions. Michael Wolff seems to go even further than that in the case for Christian nationalism. He claims that the US is suffering primarily from a lack of Christian confidence. Looking to our history, he argues that the US is a Christian nation with Christian institutions. Thus, the US needs Christian magistrates and Christian arms of government to enforce Christian norms, including in schools and all other public institutions. He advocates against allowing mosques or any other forms of religious institution other than Christian churches. And although he concedes that he won't go so far as to put heretics to death, he rejects any religious neutrality. Now, the arguments in these two books can be attacked from a number of avenues. First, Wolff's claim that the US is a Christian nation can easily be debunked by looking at the founding fathers who were deists, not Christians, including Thomas Paine, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Ethan Allen, and James Madison, and James Monroe. However, in my short time, I will confine my remarks to a brief analysis of the US Constitution and to Jesus's teachings and Jesus himself. Let's look at the Constitution. The First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So let's listen to those first two clauses again. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or making the free or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, the government shall not make any law establishing a religion, nor shall it prohibit people from freely exercising their religion. Legal scholars agree that these two clauses, taken together, guarantee religious freedom. As Bradley Gerard and Gabriella Heibel of the American Bar Association state in a July 5th, 2022 article, the Establishment Clause thus makes the Free Exercise Clause's promise of religion freedom real for everyone, not just an empowered few. That basic civics lesson was once widely understood, nonpartisan, and uncontroversial. Sadly, it's no longer all of those things. I should add, my own quick review of the US Supreme Court Establishment Clause cases revealed that the decisions are replete with language like strict neutrality. In other words, when reviewing any law regarding the imposition of or interference with religion, the Supreme Court regularly finds that the government in question must remain strictly neutral vis-a-vis any laws respecting religion. Now, it almost goes without saying that the Christian nationalist states envisioned by Torba and Wolff run afoul of both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the Constitution. Both the Torba and Wolff plans clearly violate the Establishment Clause. They advocate creating a Christian nation. Clearly, Wolff's plan violates the Free Exercise Clause as well, because he would not allow any places of worship other than Christian churches. Torba's plan would allow people of other religions to practice their religion privately, but would not allow these people to take positions of leadership. Interestingly, even under this religion-friendly Supreme Court, Torba's plan would likely fail scrutiny under the Free Exercise Clause. In their most recent ruling on the Free Exercise Clause, Kennedy versus Bramerton, this is the case involving the kneeling football coach who lost his job. It's a recent Supreme Court ruling. The court ruled that the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment protects, quote, an individual engaging in a personal religious observance from government reprisals. Clearly, Torba's refusal to allow non-Christians to hold any office would constitute a government reprisal against an individual engaging in personal religious observance. Clearly, the Constitution protects religions other than Christianity. Thus, it would violate the Free Expression Clause as well. Funnily enough, Wolff acknowledged in a YouTube interview that the Supreme Court and the Constitution would present a bit of a problem for his plan. What these Christian nationalists refuse to recognize is that their own Christianity would and should prevent any form of Christian nationalism. In fact, Jesus, by word and by deed, would reject any form of Christian government. For example, Michael Gerson, in his excellent essay published in the Washington Post on September 1st, 2022, shows that Jesus refused to advocate the establishment of a religious state. Quote, Jesus rejected the role of a political messiah. In the present age, he insisted the kingdom of God would not be the product of Jewish nationalism. It would not arrive through militancy and violence, tactics that would contribute only to a cycle of suffering. Instead, God's kingdom would grow silently, soul by soul, among you and within you, across every barrier of nation or race, in acts of justice, peacemaking, love, inclusion, meekness, humility, and gentleness. Close quote. I could go on to analyze the render unto Caesar passage of the Gospels to show that Jesus encouraged his followers to stay out of the earthly governmental realm. But given my short time here, I will conclude by reiterating that Christian nationalism violates, in my opinion, both the US Constitution and Jesus' own teachings. These purported Christians should know better.
Thank you, Dr. Goslin. It's quite interesting to hear a religiously informed and knowledgeable attorney look at this question. It also is quite clear that among Christians, there is a spectrum of opinions on this issue as you have laid out. So this is an interreligious conversation tonight, but maybe, and importantly, we also need an intra-religious conversation on this issue, as Dr. Cohen has also hinted at. So a big thank you. Again, lots of food for thought and for our following conversation. I would like to now introduce Mustafa Akyol. He is a nationally acclaimed author and an expert on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. Since 2013, he has been a frequent opinion writer for the New York Times, covering politics and religion, especially in the Muslim world. Mr. Akyol's latest book, published last year, is entitled Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. He currently serves as a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., and we welcome him tonight to offer a Muslim perspective on this evening's topic. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel, and I really enjoyed hearing thoughts of Rabbi Cohen and Dr. Goslin, and I was glad to hear the critique of Christian nationalists, which are challenging the liberal democratic, foundations of the U.S. And I think they're popular among Protestants, and there's a Catholic version of that called the integralists too. I mean, again, that's a minority view in Catholicism, but it is there. And I'm concerned about these movements because I don't know how they would go far, but they are actually empowering the forces that I myself criticize in my world, which is the world of Islam. You can call them the Muslim nationalists or the Muslim integralists, or we call them Islamists as well, which believe that there should be Islamic states and governments. And unlike in the US, in some parts of the Muslim world, these are not anti-establishment forces. These are the establishment forces, right? From Iran to Saudi Arabia to Pakistan. There are not all Muslim majority states, but there are quite a few, more than a dozen right now, I think, states, Muslim majority states, where the law is inspired by or refers to Sharia, Islamic law, and there are things like apostasy or blasphemy laws, and they certainly bring a lot of violations of religious freedom or freedom of speech or broader human rights. Now, I will speak a little bit theoretically first. I mean, theocracy, does Islam call for theocracy? Let me begin that as a Muslim. Of course, people give different meanings to the term theocracy. If theocracy means a ruler himself, it's never herself, but himself historically, being divinely guided by God, that is not actually the historical Islamic model. You can say the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, represented that model because he was a leader, both the political and the religious leader of Muslims in Medina, but that was a short period. And after him, the leadership of the Muslim community was passed on to people called caliphs, and then from the caliphs, it boiled down to sultans ultimately. And these claimed some authority. Some of them called themselves the shadow of God on earth. But the more mainstream understanding was that the ruler was not divine, but the ruler, or not divinely guided, but the ruler had to rule according to the divine law, which is the Sharia, right? So therefore, the way you put this conversation is correct. So by theocracy, if you mean religious law, as a government based on religious law, yeah, that is the issue in Islam. And it was historically considered that, yes, that's the legitimate model. From the first caliphs until the modern era, Muslims historically were ruled by governments, monarchies, dynasties, in which the ruler wasn't divinely guided, but the ruler had to obey the Sharia and uphold the Sharia. And he had some room for some secular legislation, but the Sharia was the law of the land. Now, this was not seen as a problem by most people until the modern era, because there was no different alternative to this. I mean, if you didn't have Muslim Sharia, then you would have Christian law, then you would have the Sassanid Empire and Islam. So there was nothing like a liberal democracy based on individual rights and personal liberties and so. But that appeared at some point in human history. And compared to that, in the past couple of years, Muslims began to question this model, like, do we need really Sharia-based states? And certain reforms took place in the late Ottoman Empire, for example. The people may not know that, but late Ottoman Empire actually began to move towards something like a liberal democracy, because they incorporated a lot of Western laws and established a constitution with equal rights for Jews and Christians in 1876, for example. That experiment failed because of nationalism, but there's some interesting history there. But today, a lot of Muslims, for many Muslims, well, no, what we want is a decent government. We want to be religious in the way we want it. And quite a lot of Muslims living in the West are actually quite happy to be in the West, in a free society where can they practice their religion. If they sometimes complain from something, it's that, illiberal secularism that sometimes we see in France. But for example, I know that many Muslims living in America are happy with the religious freedom in America. They probably came to America partly for that. So not that every Muslim wants this Islamic state model, but the people we call Islamists typically want that. And as I said, they already have certain governments that they control where Sharia is the rule of the land, or there are Islamic movements, Islamist movements in different parts of the Muslim world which aspire for that. So I think we need a good discussion in the world of Islam, which is still going on, of course, in four corners of the Muslim world. But to put it correctly, like, does Islam require a Sharia-based religious state? Or is Sharia something like what is halakha for Jews today, like a communal code you follow willingly, but you don't make it the law of the land? So that discussion is necessary. And for some conservatives, the answer is obvious. I mean, do you want to be ruled by the law of God or law of human beings? Of course, the law of God. I mean, what can be better than law of God? The other is nonsense, right? I mean, that's even polytheism. How dare you want human law instead of the law of God? Now, if you put it simply this way, it might look convincing, but then you have to ask the questions. Yeah, law of God, but law of God according to whom? Law of God according to the true religion, they will say. Then you can ask, well, okay, which one is the true religion? Well, it's my religion. But it doesn't stop there. Okay, but what interpretation in your religion is the true interpretation? Of course, that is my interpretation. So if you're Sunni, you would want the Sunni Sharia. If you are different schools of thought in Sunnism, if you're Salafi, that's different from some more progressive Sunnis. If you're Shia, then you want a Shia theocracy, as is the case in Iran. So ultimately, when you go down the line, when you say it is not the law of God that is being implemented, it is an interpretation of that by human beings, most typically men who come to power, by some revolution. It could be democratic too in terms of elections, but it would certainly not be a liberal democracy. That's why today, when you look in the Muslim world, you will see Islamic states, and they'll say, we are implementing the law of God. Well, no, they are implementing the Jafari school and its particular interpretation by Ayatollah Khomeini and Khamenei, his successor in Iran, that, Iraqi Shiites don't agree with that, but, that's the law in Iran. If you go to Afghanistan today, Taliban dominated Afghanistan again, and they are implementing what they understand as Hanafi jurisprudence, which many other Hanafis would not agree with, right? So ultimately, there is actually no government based on divinely guided, because God doesn't really guide us. God gave us a scripture, a message, a script, but how do we understand it? It's our business for centuries. And recognition of that is actually the beginning of wisdom, I think, on this issue. Since it is always be dominated by human beings somehow, How can we make it more just and less coercive? And you come to the idea that, well, in this case, what should maybe happen is that we should have a system of government where everybody under that government may be able to follow their religious convictions without imposing that on others, right? And that government, in that sense, should not protect Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Sunni Islam or Hanafi Islam or Shia Islam and impose it on others, or Hindu nationalism, right? That's another model in India these days. It's a government that should protect the rights of every human being, individual rights, human rights. So that's the liberal form of government, and the combination of that we call liberal democracy. Now that model is being challenged in different corners of the world today, in the West as well, as our scholars, speakers put it. But I think that concern is that challenge is very concerning. The people who concern this are not telling us what was there before liberal democracy, right? I mean, some people say, oh, no, we should go back to a Christian government. Well, we've seen that, right? I mean, we've seen religious wars and persecutions. That is why actually the whole idea of liberal democracy came to be. Or these utopian Islamists are saying, oh, we should have this beautiful Islamic government. And every time you do it, it turns into the tyranny of one Islamic group. And they say, no, this failed, but the next one will be the best one. Well, it keeps on happening the same thing. So I think we need democracy, liberal democracy. And I want to emphasize that because democracy can turn into the tyranny of the majority, right? That's the risk actually we're seeing in the different parts of the world, in my country, Turkey, for sure. In India and elsewhere in the West, there are movements towards that. And that is why it's important, I think, to keep the First Amendment principles in the United States, and this is a limited government where different religious groups exist. And we see the blessings of that already, as people who have lived and flourished in these countries. And I think there are Muslims who think that no, what we have is in an Islamic model. They believe in that, but you can certainly interpret Islam, as many other people have done, as not a government but a religion, not a state but a message, which was the motto of Ali Razak, which was a big scholar in 1925. He wrote this book in Egypt, criticizing the idea that the caliphate is an integral part of Islam. It was a historical experience of Muslims. So there is certainly an interpretation of Islam which accepts secular liberal government. And I think the more we keep those governments robust and really liberal, those interpretations will thrive in the Muslim world as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. What I notice is a certain common thread that each of you have talked about the challenges and the conversation going on within the religion as well. That your voices are a specific voice that have a certain consonance with one another, but that it's a debate, as you pointed out, that is still to be had and still to be fought over. What is religion really call us to do? And is divine law, even though if it's accepted that that's the right way, it's being interpreted by human beings. This is, I think, a fascinating point that you're making, and we will begin to talk about this. So to begin our conversation with each other, I would first like to turn to our three young participants to give us and them the chance to respond to what they have heard, to ask questions, or to provide comments. Naomi Moskowitz is a senior in her last quarter at UCLA. Prior to UCLA, she grew up in a Jewish household and was educated at Jewish schools in the Bay Area. At UCLA, she studies cognitive science and Arabic studies and is fascinated by the nexus of the Abrahamic faith, and particularly their origins in and relationships to the Middle East. During her time at UCLA, She has worked to promote religious life on campus, and this past year helped to establish an interfaith living learning community, a UCLA dorm catered to religious students, which is a marvelous and wonderful achievement at a public university. So, Naomi, the floor is yours. What are your thoughts, comments, questions?
Thank you so much for the introduction. I sort of thought of a recent conversation that I had with some of my friends on campus about the separation of church and state, as Dr. Goslin, you mentioned. And in this conversation, I stated my opinion that I felt like this separation was sort of dwindling. And to me, it felt like recent decisions that have been made by politicians are informed by their political as well as their religious views. And I think with politicians who have certain upbringings and certain views, it's hard to say whether those views and their religious affiliations particularly are affecting their politics, or are they trying to make a separation, you know, in their heads, actively trying to make that separation when they're making decisions. So I'm wondering if you all think that it's sort of inherent that politicians will be making decisions with their religious biases in mind, and that the solution to continuing to have separation of church and state is to just have more, a larger variety and more diversity in those representatives. And so that way we have lots of different opinions. Or if you think that now is a time when possibly the government needs to make a more concerted effort to figure out how the political opinions and the decisions that our politicians are making are really separate from their personal views, oftentimes views that are informed by their religious backgrounds.
Thank you for that question, Naomi. And the way I hear it, it's addressed to all three panelists, right?
Yeah, definitely addressed to everyone.
Yeah. So I don't want to make assignments, but just feel free to respond. And the more lively we can have a back and forth, the better it is. What are your thoughts on Naomi's comments?
All right, I'll jump in. Thanks for that question. Great question. Really, really important question. It's kind of at the center of our political life. It's somewhat reminiscent of a question that the academics on the panel will remember about whether or not there's value neutral scholarship, right? Whether or not one's biases in scholarship impact one's scholarship, or whether one can leave those behind and be value neutral. And by now it's pretty obvious to everybody that there's no such thing as value neutral scholarship. The question is, how much do you separate out, do you bracket your biases when you approach a text or approach a historical problem? I think the question is now, as you put it, is whether or not only politicians, but of course I think you might probably have in mind also Supreme Court justices, for example, and president, whether or not they should approach decisions with their religious values front and center, or whether obviously their understanding of law and culture and society is impacted by religion as much as by everything else, but should try to, as much as possible, bracket those and decide on the basis of the law, obviously knowing that ultimately everybody fails to filter out their own prejudices. And I think that that's kind of the most important question. I think we've moved, unfortunately, over the past 50 years towards a judicial culture in which, in some quarters, it is privileged. One privileges one's religious views. Now, as somebody who is a religious social justice activist, I think that there's a lot of resources in religious traditions to guide certain decisions that are in the public space. But that's different, and that's part of my value system. And the reason why I advocate for certain things and not for other things, but that's different than saying that as Professor Goslin said, that Christian nationalists who say that the Constitution should be supplanted by the teachings of Jesus. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say, but other people have.
Yeah, thank you.
Naomi, thank you for that question. And I'll just jump in quickly and agree with Rabbi Cohen that it's kind of impossible for people to separate out all of these views. However, each of our elected officials and our Supreme Court justices and our judges take an oath to uphold our Constitution. And the Constitution is, if you follow the Supreme Court decisions, and even up to today, they still continue to regard the Constitution as being religiously neutral. And so if they're being faithful to their oath, then they should be being religiously neutral. Now, I agree with you. I'm not sure that we're seeing a complete neutrality, but I think that perhaps we need to just emphasize the importance of that oath and the importance of our religiously neutral Constitution. So thanks for your question.
Thank you. Mr. Eckel, you want to chime in?
I'm still learning about American cultural wars and religious controversies. I just want to say that, of course, it's crucial for people who hold public power to be neutral, as much as they can, of course, right? And that's what the Constitution requires from them. I just should say that, it is inevitable that, of course, people's conscientious opinions about ethics and values will inevitably influence their positions, right? That's why some people on the legal spectrum fall into the conservative or the other side. And there is nothing necessarily wrong with that unless it turns into a coercive act of imposing one worldview onto another. And that worldview can be a religious worldview. That can be also a secularist worldview as well, too, right? Because we see that as well. In France is the most dramatic case of saying that this is how the proper dress for women is. It's not the headscarf. Well, it's not you to decide, right? Your job is to protect individual rights. So let them make those decisions. So, and I think once certain, sometimes secularist worldviews turn assertive, they also provoke assertiveness on the other side, or they justify assertiveness on the other side as well. So it's hard to keep the public space neutral, but I think we should, with goodwill, because there's value in that, people from religious convictions or secular convictions or progressive convictions, whatever you call it, should try to keep it as neutral as possible and fair as possible, where nobody's shunned, but nobody also dominates. A civil public square, not a religious or a secularized, one too.
Yeah, like a civil public square, like we are modeling tonight. I believe.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Let us turn to Hannah Greason. She graduated from Westmont College in Santa Barbara with a degree in political science with an emphasis on international security and development. She also attended the American University of Cairo in Egypt, where she studied Islam, Coptic Christianity, and Arabic. And she now works in Washington, D.C. at the Norwegian Refugee Council, USA. The Norwegian Refugee Council is one of the world's largest humanitarian organizations, providing aid to refugees and displaced persons in over 50 countries. Hannah is passionate about the intersection of humanitarian work and US foreign policy, with particular attention to the role of faith-based organizations, which of course directly connects with our topic for tonight. So Hannah, the floor is yours. What are your questions, reflections, thoughts for us?
Thank you, Krauss. And I want to say, first of all, thank you to all the panelists so far. These have been incredibly insightful comments, and I've really appreciated everything that's been said in Naomi's question as well. I think you all have touched on a lot of the threats to the current models of liberal democracy that we see around the world, and I don't think that those threats are a secret. I think most people are aware and concerned about a lot of these, but I was hoping to kind of touch more on the relationship between some of the economic and social discontent and the role that that has played in some movements away from liberal democracy and towards more kind of modern models of more theocratic governance. I think anecdotally, I kind of grew up hearing much more examples of ways in which that sort of discontent moved nations or communities towards liberal democracy. And I think as I've gotten older, anecdotally, I've seen more ways in which that's moved communities or countries more towards maybe theocratic or more liberal models of democracy. So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that relationship and current trends and things that you think might be missed in the current discourse about the decline of democracy around the world.
Thank you. And I want to say, if you don't need to be one of the presenters to chime in, and it doesn't need to be a lengthy answer. And I don't like to make assignments.
I'll hop in, Reinhard. Just briefly, Hannah, thank you for your question. I think you've astutely identified an issue that is certainly a problem here in the United States, or an issue here in the United States. And I think it's the feeling of resentment that people, perhaps rural people who if I can use like vast generalizations, but I think in some ways they hold true, that the urban intellectuals tend to skew a little less religious, and the rural, people tend to skew more religious. And I think that and I think we also have the rural people perhaps in general seem to be slightly less people of means, whereas the urban people have more means. And in this way, I think that people feel that they're being spoken down to, that the secularists, are elitists, and they're leaving out their concerns. And so I think there is an appeal toward theocracy because they feel like they're being talked down to, and they're being, not held in esteem. And I think that, what we need to do in our democracies is make sure that everyone is valued, each voice is valued, and that we can show a way that a liberal democracy can value the input of these people without them being diminished or feeling slighted. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I don't know whether this was behind your question, Hannah, as well, of whether the increasing wealth gap is also a religious question. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that perhaps in part also a question that needs to concern us as in an interreligious conversation?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a part of my question and kind of behind what I was asking about.
Also, may I add one thing? Thank you, Hannah, for the question. And in me, it triggered some thought about the international scene and the global scene, let's say. Again and again, I mean, in the past century and this one, we've seen this phenomenon of sometimes liberal democracy failing to deliver as much as people hoped from it. And then people are drawn into some other model. I mean, we need a strong man to solve all these problems, and let's give him all the power, right? All this freedom thing is just complicating things. They're immigrants we don't like, somebody should kick them out. And somebody should, with hierarchy and discipline and efficiency. So, I mean, that was the drive between fascism, I mean, in the 30s, right? And some right or left-wing populism today in different parts of the world, civilizational nationalism, like, I mean, you see that, like populist leaders surfing on those. I mean, in Tunisia, there has been a backsliding of democracy in the year, because Tunisia has become a rare liberal democracy in the Arab world, and economically it wasn't doing great. So yeah, I mean, you have to work on those issues. But the promise that we have some issues and we need a strong man to come and solve these problems with a magic wand, and let's give him all the power, that has historically proved to be a very dangerous seduction, which led to worse results than what you already have. And so I think societies learned that by experience, hopefully without too many bad experiences, the value of liberal democracy can be realized again at a time when a lot of people are finding it inadequate, because you don't have a strong-willed man to put his fist on the table and do everything right. But well, that won't make everything right, and you will painfully realize that.
I think that this is a great question. I think it's a central religious issue, and I'm less optimistic than you, Mustafa, that society has learned lessons from the past. But
for a while, then they go back to the
right. It's definitely true that economic issues have led in the past to, I mean, the Weimar Germany's out of control poverty and inflation led to the rise of Nazism and Hitler, and not only there, of course, and also the Russian Revolution was driven by economic complaints. And in the United States, the one thing that the right and the left, or even the far right and the far left, have in common is recognizing that capitalism is not working, and that there are large parts of the country that are not, whose lives are not being improved by capitalism. And so this anti-capital, the question then is, this is definitely this is a religious question. Well, the Bible says both that the poor will never leave your midst, but also the obligation to support the poor and to create structures in society so that there's a fair distribution of resources. And that tension is at the heart of our country, the capitalist system, and the way that the capitalist system is interpreted by religions is, certain Protestant understandings of, wealth and success is a sign of divine favor in certain circles. In other circles, like Dorothy Day created the Catholic workers because of the fact that Jesus's teachings was that you have to split, and actually Jesus took it from Isaiah, but okay, that what you have, your basic command is to give your bread to the poor. And I think that this is a basic religious, I think this is the most important religious issue that we have to struggle with, is how to create a fair and just society in which we overcome the gap, the wealth gap, and we have a more equal distribution of resources in society. Because without that, I mean, there is a danger to democracy, but there's also a danger to human life. And so when, as Mustafa said, when there are no reasonable, logical, rational solutions, so then you get, Trump, who comes in and says, I will solve your problems. Or you get other, Orban, who says, what your problems really are? It's immigrants. What your problems really are, and so that, but that's so the religious value is to hold at the same time the fact that everybody is equally, everybody has an equal right to thrive, because everybody was created in the image of God, and therefore everybody is deserving of at least a basic economic survival, at the same time as the fact that we have to create a society in which there are structures and institutions that can support that, rather than hoping, thinking that, believing in the myth of a single strong political power.
Hannah, you want to chime in based on what you've heard, or was your question fully answered?
No, yeah, those were all great reflections. I was just thinking back to Naomi's question, and you had touched on this, Dr. Cohen, about kind of that tension of religious beliefs being really important, which the ways in which we engage with social and economic justice, and like ideally this multiracial democracy that protects minority rights, that your religious values could feed into that. But then also, where do you kind of have those questions of what's the line between like moral lawmaking and religious lawmaking, and how do you address all these different systems? So there's lots of good reflections, and maybe that's just kind of my question that goes a little bit back to Naomi's.
Yeah, thank you. And now to Rasik Hussein, welcome to the conversation as well. Rasik graduated with a master's degree in public policy at UCLA, and during his time at UCLA, he was active in the Muslim Student Association. Rasik now works as a policy analyst at the Los Angeles Mayor's Office. And his identity as an American Muslim, his academic background, and his current work setting give you a unique vantage point on tonight's topic. So how does it look from your vantage point, Rasik?
I don't want to speak for the whole city of LA or the mayor's office or anything. So
I said a front row
just
seat, not that you are deciding all the policies. You're an analyst of public policy, not a maker of public policy.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time, and I want to thank all the presenters and all the commenters as well. I noticed a theme in all the presentations, and that basically it seems like liberalism is sort of the default neutral state. It seems like so we should strive to make our governments and our societies closer to that sort of to that ideology. And I think Mr. Eichel had mentioned, when you try to implement a religious law or God's law, then you have different interpretations of it. Everyone has their own. And I was just wondering, Mr. Eichel brought up the example of France. It's in my mind, and just the limited political learnings that I had at UCLA, is the birthplace of liberalism and the Enlightenment ideas. And wouldn't they say that their version of liberalism is the correct one that's being implemented, that is disadvantaging some populations over there, Muslims among them? And so the first question I would have is, how do you solve that differing interpretations of liberalism? And the second question is, what does the society do, what does the government do when the aims of a secular state and aims of secularism conflict with religious people's rights and attitudes, like in France, for example?
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be interested to hear any of the presenters.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. A wonderful question. I think let's first go to Mr. Akyol, because I think you touched on that in your presentation as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Rasik. I mean, I would doubt the observation that France is the birthplace of liberalism, or I could say that there are different strains in what you call liberalism, or even the Enlightenment, right? And the French strain, with exceptions like Montesquieu, especially with the French Revolution and the radical French Enlightenment, typically had a problem with religion. Has been anti-clericalism, was a feature of the French Revolution and even the Enlightenment as well. That's historically because the Catholic Church was very dominant in France, and it was allied with the monarchy, and the struggle for freedom was historically against the Catholic Church, right? Which was then extended to religion in general. And I see it as a fundamentally insufficiently liberal conception, because it has a very little sense of religious freedom. It's always freedom from religion. Religion is seen as a problem to be constrained. By liberalism, I subscribe to, and I mainly refer to, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, beginning with John Locke, and that ultimately flourished in the United States, where freedom of religion is a key value, maybe the fundamental first value. And that is mainly about protecting religion from the state, rather than protecting the state from religion, which is the other way around. So yeah, people mean different things by religion. But the word, if you ask to France today, liberalism is not a very popular word in France. It's generally seen as market capitalism, and I'm not against that, by the way. But of course, a more better capitalism is always possible, with more, let's say, civil society and network for, of course, people in need. So that's what I would say. So, I mean, if there is a country that represents liberalism historically, I think it's the United States, number one, and followed by or some European countries like Norway, for sure. I mean, we have a guest from Norway. I should honor that. I mean, Norway is probably the freest country in the world, right? I mean, our human freedom index by Cato generally shows that. But France has historically had a specific problem with religious expressions. And we see that in the banning of hijab, big crosses and kippas for Jewish people, and there are issues with halal slaughter and so on. So that is a problem. I don't see it as a good model of liberalism. Now, will liberalism prevent religious communities from practicing some of their religious commandments, right? Yes, they will, but I think generally that is good. Like, for example, liberalism will prevent a religious community from punishing their heretics or apostates, right? But they shouldn't do that in the first place, in my view. So, I mean, and Islamically, we can speak, I don't think actually in Islam we need blasphemy laws or apostasy laws. That's a kind of reformist argument. But so whatever the tensions, there are issues like, for example, a liberal state, will it tolerate polygamy? Well, you can make an argument that actually it should, because the state should not interfere in the private. So there are some kind of gray areas, although I wouldn't advocate polygamy in the first place, and I would criticize that religiously as well too. So yes, I mean, you can say, if I want to practice my Islam, this includes all of these, and I want to have all of those. Yes, a liberal state will not allow you to do some of those, but those are generally about coercive measures of using coercion to prevent your religion, or I mean, your religious tradition might allow domestic violence. I mean, Taliban certainly allows that, and a liberal state will not allow you that, but the liberal state doesn't allow you that for the good reason, I would say. Of course, this is a liberal perspective in itself, but and ultimately there's no wonderful ideal heaven on earth. I mean, I should say there's no better model. But I think for a practicing Muslim, if you speak today in the world, where do you want to practice your religion? What is the best place to practice Islam? I doubt it's Iran or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia or any country, you name it. I think it is a country that is like the United States or Canada or Norway or UK, or that really allows you to practice your religion as an individual and community. Don't forget, I mean, in for example, UK, there are even Sharia courts. People can arrange their marriage and divorce, which actually the Orthodox Jewish community established many, Betin, I mean. So you can actually have your even Sharia focused life in a liberal society, and religion freedom is about guaranteeing that as well. So that, yes, there would be limits to practice, but I think the right limits in a truly liberal political system are decent limits. Yes.
No.
Hope this
Well,
makes
thank you.
sense.
Does Dr. Cohen or Dr. Goslin want to chime in, or?
I'm happy to chime in. I maybe I'll throw some, maybe this will be a provocative statement, but I think that so far we've spoken about ritual aspects of religion and whether the secular state does limit that. And there are, I mean, there's another example is circumcision. Should the state limit circumcision or female genital mutilation? I think that's a question that's a serious question. I mean, it means, like, what is the impact of circumcision? What is the state's interests? Does the state protect the child, the rights of the child in that sense? But I think that a larger question is when the aims of religion are broader than ritual. So, for example, in poverty relief. So what's the role of government in poverty relief? And if that's a religious value, and then, that comes into conflict with certain notions of secularism in which the government shouldn't be involved with that, private philanthropy, other questions. And that is, to a certain extent, is a religious conflict or religious. We've heard a lot about religious freedom when it comes to, the wedding cakes and things that, anti-gay or not supplying, not providing abortions. But on the other hand, there is now working its way through different courts a claim of religious freedom saying that welcoming immigrants is a religious obligation and therefore not allowing the welcoming of immigrants is an impingement on religious freedom. So those are the kind of conflicts which I think are interesting because they also, I think they're important also, but they're interesting because of the fact that they're actually arguments about what the state should, what are the aims of the state, not only aims of secularism, aims of religion, but what are the aims of the state? Should a state, what obligations of care does the state as a state have versus the obligations of care that individuals have? And I think that there are religious conflicts in that itself.
This even raises the question of whether liberalism or liberal ideology is one competing religion among others. If you push it to the extreme, right? Or is that one step too far?
Yeah, I want to just jump in for a second. I'm sorry that I don't want to, but you mentioned the problems with French liberalism, which agreed. That coming, the secular, the coercive secular state, but also American liberalism, even though America, is to a large extent good, but American liberalism also hides the fact that this country was created on, with slavery and genocide of Native Americans. And that doesn't go away. It's not as if that there's, that we're over that. But the way that we practice liberalism in a certain way, that doesn't get expression in this, in the same way, and that could be a problem. I think that's a problem with liberalism also, rather than having a more nuanced understanding of society where rights are not equally distributed.
Rasik, does this answer your question or is probably providing you with more food for thought?
Yeah, it definitely, it's a buffet of food for thought for sure. I definitely appreciate the responses. To me, I think about, there seems to be a notion that you can only have sort of a multicultural, racial society if it is, under sort of a liberal secular democracy. And, my question would be, is there a way to, combine, forms of religious governance in the past with democracy, for example, and I'm only speaking from the Islamic perspective, but shura councils or something like that, where you would have elected representatives in that way, so just to basically counter the idea that the only form of sort of multi-ethnic harmony can be from liberalism.
So the question is also, as I hear it, are religious communities given the freedom to self-govern in a democratic liberal state, right? And is that possible?
And basically, is it impossible to have a comprehensive religious state that is representative of all people that live in the state?
I can say a few things on that.
Say that again.
I can say if I can share a few thoughts on this very good point that Rasik raised. Like, what are the possible alternatives to the secular liberal model? By the way, by liberalism, the term has evolved into something else in American politics, like a central left politics. We're discussing about the basic small L liberalism, that is, this government based on individual rights and inalienable rights of human beings. So that's the basic liberal idea, and system of checks and balances, and democracy as well. Now, the alternative, Rasik, what you say is interesting. There was an Islamic alternative to what we call liberalism today, and that was the classical Islamic system of the protected peoples, right? I mean, there was the Islamic governments, there was a Khilafah, and Jews and Christians had their laws. They had internal laws of their own. And some people say, well, actually, that was better because there was liberalism imposes one law, national law, on everybody, whereas in the old system, the Ottoman system, the millet system, for example, people had their own laws, communities. It was more pluralistic, so therefore more free, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem with that, the argument is that, first of all, that system, yes, you had multiple legal systems, so it was pluralistic, but there was a hierarchy between those religious groups, right? Muslims had more rights than Jews or Christians. And 1,000 years ago, that was a pretty actually good deal. That's why it was much better than being forced to convert to another religion. That's why Jews repeatedly fled from Christendom to the lands of Islam, to the Ottoman Empire, for example, when they were persecuted in the very illiberal Christendom of the time. But still, that was a difference. It was not equality under the law, right? It was like a hierarchical. Second, if you look into late Ottoman modernization, the Tanzimat reforms, the Ottomans actually began to get rid of the system and bring in equal laws for everybody. And sometimes people think this was just a Western imposition. There was a little bit of that, but there was also the fact that the more society became more engaged and more trade and interaction grew, you couldn't sustain this system where Jews have a different court and Christians have a different court and Muslims have a different court. And the more, I mean, in a very integrated society with endless transactions every day, financial, legal, you need a single law. That's why the Ottomans brought these secular courts in the 19th century, because they couldn't catch up with this whole, because in the pre-modern world, people lived in their neighborhoods and things, and they really didn't interact with that community that much. So, I think while the Islamic system of this hierarchical legal pluralism was a great contribution to human history, I think there was nothing necessarily Islamic about it, in the sense that an eternally established structure of Islam. And I think the liberal model of equality for citizens, and also don't forget that communal model didn't allow heretics in the community too. So heretics suffered more than the others. So when you compare, I think today the freedom, religious freedom, freedom of speech, we find in decent liberal democracies are better than other historical examples, right? Broadly speaking. Our religions are compatible with this. Do they demand this? That's another question. But I think in Islam, we can make the argument that it's compatible. It's better for Muslims. But just as a comparative perspective, I think there are, at least from what we know today, I mean, I wouldn't want to go back to a kind of a millet system. At least I'm sure Jews and Christians may not want that, because they would not be equal citizens.
Yeah, let me.
I'm not even getting into
ask,
the atheists and others who wouldn't even have a community, and whether their legal system. That's a whole different story.
No, thank you. Very, very thoughtful food for thought, again, those comments. Let me ask, maybe in conclusion, a final question. Is democracy only being advocated by minorities because they fare better? And when a minority becomes a majority, there is the danger of wanting an authoritarian regime and not respecting. And is the protection of minorities ultimately a religious value? because it doesn't seem to be self-evident, as the Declaration of Independence says. I mean, both Mr. Akel and Rabbi Cohen have said it's the best, the United States is the best place to live because minorities are protected. It's a different thing when the majority becomes the minority becomes the majority. The early Christians were a persecuted minority. When they became the majority and allied with the powers of the state, it became a very different story. So do we, as religious people, need to also advocate for the protection of minorities on religious grounds? And you talked about the teachings of our three traditions, namely the deeply held belief that all human beings are owe their being to one single creator.
So I think what he's saying is obviously true in the sense that democracy isn't by itself a liberal democracy, and it's the protection of minority rights, which makes it a liberal democracy in a certain sense. Right? And we're seeing now the rise of illiberal democracies, where the sign of a democracy is that there are elections. But if there are elections and then the majority can just run over and steamroll minorities, then it's not a liberal democracy. I think that if it is a religious value, that the world will become a more just place in which everybody can worship God in their own way, which I think it is, then a democracy which is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy, which protects minority rights, is a religious interest. Because I think it's not only in the United States. In the United States, we're starting to see with Christian nationalism, with the alt-right, and some, we see some right-wing Orthodox groups throwing in with Christian nationalists, which is just absurd on its face because their actual belief systems are completely incompatible with each other. But it's all about it, if democracy and politics is just about power, then you want to be in the majority so that you could run roughshod over the minority. So I think that it is a value to not have that.
Yes.
I mean, I think I would say that human dignity is a religious value, right? And that is the dignity of every created human being. And of course, those beings are in different groups, or maybe they're just single individuals, but they're fundamental. The idea that, God-given rights, I think it's a powerful idea in human history, like natural rights that are given by inalienable rights. And regardless of their color, regardless of their religion, regardless of their worldview or lifestyle or orientation, they have a dignity that has to be respected. And I think our religious traditions have strong roots to make that argument. You can say man is created in the image of God, and you can say in Islam, human beings are the vicegerents of God on earth. So you can make these theological arguments. And based on that, of course, individual rights and in group rights, because groups actually come out of the individuals. Individuals collectively form those. Yes, you can make those arguments for sure. It's important.
Yes. Yeah.
And certainly, Reinhard, from the perspective of a liberation theologian, the theory of liberation theology is that Jesus has a preferential option a preference for the poor, for the minority, for the downtrodden, and that our responsibility is, as Christians, is to lift up the minority, the poor, the downtrodden, and we hope that in a liberal democracy, we can also express those values of lifting up the poor and the downtrodden and the minority. But at this point, I'm not sure it's a sure thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think Naomi had a comment.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Dr. Krauss, for this question, because I'm not sure if Rabbi Cohen would agree with me, but from the Jewish perspective, I think this is something that we're sort of, or me, myself, learning about it. I've been struggling with a lot or thinking about a lot, because the Jews, we went from being a minority all around the world, and now with the establishment of the state of Israel, got thrust into this position of being the minority. And for American Jews, democracy and liberalism is really important because we were always the minority. So I just want to say thank you for your question, because I think it's something that me as a Jewish person and many people in the Jewish community are sort of thinking about, is how do we make that transition from being a minority to being the majority, and how and if our values should change or not.
Food for thought. We provided lots of food for thought. I want to thank each and every one of you for contributing to the beautiful bouquet. I believe we also modeled what a civic and civil conversation across religious traditions should look like, could look like. I want to thank you for participating, for your thoughts. And I would like to invite our audience to tune in again next week at the same time at 6 o'clock Pacific time. But for now, I will say goodbye with a big thank you to each one of you. Good night.